For most people, when they think of ancient Ireland, it seldom conjures up thoughts of an advanced system of law. But to me, this is probably one of the most interesting and distinguishing aspects of early Irish culture. And whenever I talk to people about this, I'm always struck by how little even Irish people are aware of the system of law that applied in Ireland for millennia prior to invasion and conquest by England. For people who are so in tune with their history and culture, it is a strange peculiarity to find so little is known of early Irish law, because it was once one of the most forward-thinking and progressive systems of its time, and possibly even to this day. We refer to them today as the Brehon Law, and what we know of them has literally been pieced together from the fragments of manuscripts left over through history. The picture that is revealed is that this ancient society was made up of a highly advanced and civilized people who had a deep connection with natural law and a sense of justice. The Brehon Law was originally an oral tradition dating back since time immemorial, and it was not written down until around the 7th century. This native system of law was indigenous to the people living on that land, and it was indicative of their customs and their nature, and it was starkly different from imposed colonial systems of law. Indigenous systems mature gradually and naturally in line with the people living on that land and using it. So tonight I'm going to be exploring the demise of the Brehon Law in Ireland throughout history. And while I'll be highlighting a few of the features of the Brehon Law as they come up, the main focus is going to be on the attack on the law and the attack against Irish culture by the Vatican and the Crown of England. So if you're looking to learn more about the Brehon Laws in particular, what they were like, the features that they had, there's another podcast up on the Mixcloud account, the Turner Sear Mixcloud account, which goes into that. It's called An Introduction to the Brehon Laws. But a famous Roman jurist and scholar and statesman named Cicero once said that history is the witness that testifies to the passing of time. It illumines reality, vitalizes memory, provides guidance in daily life, and brings us tidings of antiquity. So tonight's going to be a bit of a history lesson as we journey through the centuries of social, political, cultural, and even spiritual upheaval that happened on this land known as Ireland. Now, I'm not going to go back into its ancient past. I'm going to focus on the influence of Anglo-Norman invasions in Irish history. But before I go back that far, I just want to talk about a proclamation that was issued by King James I of England in 1603. And this proclamation marked the official end of the Brehon Law, even though remnants remained sort of embedded in the cultural identity and the nature of the people. The Attorney General for Ireland at that time, under King James I, was called Sir John Davies, and he was a man who was instrumental in the final abolishment of the Brehon Laws. But he once said of Ireland that there is no nation of people under the sun that loves equal and indifferent justice better than the Irish, or will rest better satisfied with the execution thereof, even though it be against themselves, so that they too may have the protection and the benefit of the law when upon just cause they desire it. So this was a guy who seemed to hold the Irish in high regard, or at least their approach to justice in high regard. But even still, Davies was a man who believed in the supremacy of the monarch, and he believed that King James was the rightful king of Ireland, and that a king cannot be considered sovereign where others give laws without reference to him. So the existence of native Irish law undermined the authority of the laws issued by decree of the sovereign of the crown. So to fully appreciate the severity of this prolonged attack on native Irish society and their system of law, we must trace its demise a little further back through history. Now, I've said before that, and I think it's a true statement to make, that the laws of a land are an irrebuttable witness to the character of the people who inhabit it. In order for the English conquest of Ireland to be successful, it was essential that the native Irish laws be eradicated and replaced with the authority and dominance of the King's Law. The first significant advance occurred in 1155, when the Catholic Pope Adrian IV, the Vatican's first and only ever English Pope, issued the Papal Bull Laudabiliter, which sanctioned the invasion of Ireland by King Henry II. This Papal Bull bestowed the title of Dominus Hiberniae, the Lord of Ireland, and made Ireland a feudal possession of King Henry II's. In return for this, he was to collect a penny per hearth of the tax roll to be paid to the Vatican, and he was to establish the supremacy of the papacy and canon law over the land. Specifically, he was to bring about the Gregorian reforms, the reforms of Pope Gregory, which included the celibacy of priests and the centrality, the supremacy of the Church of Rome. Someone once said of King Henry that there is indeed no doubt, as thy highness doth also acknowledge, that Ireland and all other islands which Christ the Son of Righteousness has illumined, and which have received the doctrines of the Christian faith, belong to the jurisdiction of St. Peter and the Roman Holy Church. And that was actually a quote from the Papal Bull itself. It wasn't from Henry II. It's text from the Papal Bull, which basically declares the supremacy of the Roman Church over anywhere where the sun rises in the world, and by proxy all the islands of Europe. But the Anglo-Norman invasion of Ireland began shortly after this decree was given, shortly after this permission was given by the Pope. And the invasion began in 1169. And it had been, at this stage, there was a new Pope in power, and it was further authorised by this Pope, as Pope Alexander III. And when Pope Alexander III gave authorisation, he did so with the intention or to give the king the power to, quote, end the filthy practices of the barbarous nation. And of course, once again, to secure the Irish people with a levy to Rome, to get a tax paid from Ireland to Rome. But a further catalyst was required for this invasion of Ireland. And this occurred when the King of Leinster at the time, the Irish King of Leinster, and I must point out that the Irish system of kings was completely different than the English system of kings, even the idea of what a king was. It would be better to think of an Irish king as a leader and an English king as a ruler. But the King of Leinster at the time, Dermot MacMurrough, sought the English king help in regaining control of his kingdom. In 1166, upon the death of Muchtar MacLachlan, who was the Irish Ard Rí, or High King, and chief of Tyrone at the time, when he died, Dermot MacMurrough lost the protection of the High King. And when the new High King came into power, who was called Rory O'Connor, Dermot MacMurrough was dispossessed of his lands. Basically, he was sort of sent into exile, and the reason he'd done this is because earlier he had abducted the wife of another king, Turner O'Rourke. So there's all sorts of mad political intrigue going on back then, robbing each other's wives and all this sort of stuff. And so in a bid to reclaim his throne, MacMurrough went and sought the help of King Henry II, and this happened in the year of 1166. And Henry agreed to this request because he could see that he would strengthen his power over Ireland at the same time. But it wasn't until MacMurrough met a Welsh baron who was called Strigul, or he's better known by his nickname Strongbow. And Strongbow was the second Earl of Pembroke, Richard de Clare. By offering his daughter Aoife's hand in marriage in return for his regaining the kingship of Leinster, MacMurrough managed to secure the support he was desperately needing, and Strongbow agreed to help him in his cause, reclaiming his control over the kingdom of Leinster. So the first Norman knights landed on Irish soil in 1167, and on the 23rd of August, a few years later in 1170, Strongbow landed at Waterford with 1,000 troops and 200 knights, and quickly captured control of the territory. They then quickly moved through the neighbouring Viking settlements of Wexford and Dublin and conquered them also. And shortly after this, true to his word, MacMurrough gave his daughter Aoife's hand in marriage to Strongbow, and they're married in Christchurch Cathedral. And even if you go to Christchurch Cathedral in Dublin today, there is an effigy there to Strongbow to this day. So once MacMurrough's power was restored, he was back King of Leinster. Unfortunately, what he'd done is he'd basically invited these Anglo-Norman troops and the help of King Henry into Ireland. So he'd given them this, way in to begin the invasion, just to get his power restored over the kingship of Leinster. But in 1171, the same year that his power was restored, he died. Pretty early on, it was actually in May of that year, so he didn't have the throne for too long. So upon his death, his son Donald MacMurrough claimed the kingship of Leinster according to his rights under the Brehon Law. But at the same time, Strongbow claimed the kingship through the right of his wife, Aoife, as was promised to him by Dermot MacMurrough. So just to explain that a little bit more, inheritance under the Brehon Law was very different than inheritance under English law. And Donald MacMurrough, as the son of Dermot MacMurrough, the King of Leinster, he claimed the kingship. But as part of the agreement, which would have been valid under English law, Dermot had promised the kingship to Strongbow. And the reason why I bring that up is because it's an interesting example of one of the first times where we see this conflict of legal systems. Usually when we think of the conflict between Ireland and England, we automatically think of it as being a religious one, and we seldom have ever stopped to think of it as being a legal one. So, this is just an example of where you can see friction between the two legal systems. So, once they conquered the areas of Waterford, Wexford and Dublin, these became known as the Pale, or in Irish, An Fáil. And the word Pale is derived from the Latin word palus, P-A-L-U-S, meaning a stake which supports a fence. So the word Pale is where we get the idea of a boundary. So the Pale of Wexford, Waterford and Dublin was pretty much the boundary between English and Irish rule on the island. And while Strongbow was in Ireland, he had significantly increased his power and prestige through his invasion, and fearing the rise of a rival Norman state in Ireland, King Henry started to get a little bit restless. So what Strongbow did is he decided to surrender the strongholds of the Pale over to King Henry. in return he could keep his land and titles. This is the way they work. It's all bribery and threats, veiled threats and things like this. Politics, if you will. But before the end of the year, King Henry became the first English king to stand on Irish soil and breathe Irish air. He held a Curia Regis, or King's Council, at Waterford, where he proclaimed the laws of England to be freely and received and confirmed in Ireland. This proclamation was nothing more than a statement of intent, because in reality the English law was only applying in the Pale. The rest of Ireland, everywhere outside Waterford, Wexford and Dublin, continued to keep true to the native Irish traditions, continue to speak their language and their customs, keep their customs. So King Henry was succeeded by his son, King John of England, who received the title of Dominus Hiberniae, Lord of Ireland, from his father, because title is like property, and you can pass title from one person to another. You can transfer property, and these sort of titles transfer upon death. So upon the death of King Henry, the title that was given to him by the Church, by the Vatican, Lord of Ireland, was then passed over to his son, King John of England. And during his reign, King John increased control over the east coast of Ireland and pushed upwards towards Ulster. Using the political situation in Ireland to his advantage, King John secured the fealty, the allegiance, of many Irish lords who had been dispossessed and hoped to be restored to their lands, while simultaneously weakening the position of the Norman lords. So, just to recap this briefly, the initial invasion was an Anglo-Norman invasion. The Norman factions, if you will, began to get increasingly strong, which worried the Anglo factions who were still seated over in England, the monarchs. So during the reign of King John, he went over to Ireland, and as Lord of Ireland, he began to make agreements with the Irish lords, the Irish landowners who had been dispossessed from their lands, and who hoped to reclaim their territory back from the Norman lords. So again, politics, intrigue, bribery, and it's all for the greed of the monarchs and the lords when you get down to the nuts and bolts of it. So in 1204, King John established a system of royal writs, which first made the laws of England applicable to the colonists, and then later on established the right to trial by jury in criminal cases. And before he established this, quarrels between lords and knights were being settled by trial and wager of battle. King John gave his legal representative, the justiciar, the power to write legal writs which have authority throughout the controlled regions of Ireland. And later in 1204, he prohibited his subjects, the king prohibited his subjects, from answering in any court case to anyone but the king himself or his appointed justices. The years of political turmoil and social upheaval and the continuous battles between feuding lords all took its toll on the Irish system and Irish politics and English politics, and it led to a weakening of the imposed English rule over Ireland throughout the 13th to 15th century. And it was during this time there was a bit of a Gaelic revival. This is also the time when the Norman invaders became Nís Gaeli na na Gaeli Féin, which means more Irish than the Irish themselves. We're talking about the families like the Fitzgeralds and the Butlers and the Ormonds. As they began to intermarry, they spoke the native tongue, they began to adopt native customs, beliefs and laws. An interesting way of looking at it is, as invaders with a different culture and a different system and a different language who are coming to this country called Ireland, let's imagine Ireland is the host, and this foreign system is almost like a virus, and the virus is trying to spread throughout the land, and establish itself as the reality, as the polity of the day. So this invasion, this attempted infection of the country with a foreign culture, failed because the host actually subsumed it into itself. The existing culture that was there actually converted those who came over to change it. So that really raises the question as why were the people who were coming over changing to the Irish customs and the customs of the native Irish people? And throughout this time, England continued to unsuccessfully assert its dominance over Ireland through the imposed supremacy of Crown law and British Parliament, English Parliament. The decline of the Anglo-Norman lords through their merging with Irish culture would be described by the English, particularly the English monarchs, as degeneracy into Irish culture. With the arrival of the Black Death on Irish shores in 1348, this also weakened the Anglo-Norman strongholds. The places that were hit most were the built-up strongholds, the towns and villages that were surrounding the Pale, and the people out in rural areas were obviously hit the least. And shortly after this, an interesting piece of legislation was passed. It was really an effort of the British establishment to restrain the decay of English power in Ireland. So in 1367, they proclaimed the Statutes of Kilkenny in the reign of King Edward III. The preamble to the statutes makes the intended purpose perfectly clear. It says, "Whereas, at the conquest of the land of Ireland, the English of the said land used the English language, mode of riding and apparel, and were governed and ruled according to the English law, in due subjection. But now, many English of the said land, forsaking the English language, manners, mode of riding, laws, and usages, live and govern themselves according to the manners, fashion, and language of the Irish enemies, and also have made diverse marriages and alliances between themselves and the Irish enemies aforesaid, whereby the said land and the liege people thereof, the English language, the allegiance due to our Lord the King, and the English laws there, are put in subjection and decayed, and the Irish enemies exalted and raised up contrary to reason. Our Lord the King, considering the mischiefs aforesaid, in the consequence of the grievous complaints of the commons of his said land, called to his Parliament held at Kilkenny." You see, the Irish spoke their own native tongue, called Gaelic. They did not use saddles when riding horses. They wore different clothes, which included hooded cloaks. They grew facial hair, including moustaches, and they played their own native sports like hurling. Whenever there was a matter that needed to be resolved, a dispute, they always referred to the Irish laws, while the English did none of these things. And the Statutes of Kilkenny go on to state, "Whereas diversity of government and different laws in the same land cause difference in allegiance and disputes among the people, it is agreed and established that no Englishman, having disputes with any other Englishman, shall henceforth make caption or take pledge, distress or vengeance against any other, but that they shall sue each other at the common law, and that no Englishman be governed in the termination of their disputes by Brehon Law, which reasonably ought not be called law, being a bad custom. And if any do the contrary, and thereof be attainted, he shall be taken and imprisoned and adjudged as a traitor." So the issue here was clearly allegiance. The Bible tells us that no man can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. Desirous of establishing his royal will across the land of Ireland, King Edward's decree is actually directed at his subjects, those who have sworn allegiance to him, and he demands that all future disputes among them be settled by the English courts using the English common law, or else face the penalty of being judged a traitor to the crown. Clearly, as I said before, the people who were sent here to colonise Ireland found themselves naturally drawn towards the customs of the native Irish people. And we need not speculate too much about why this was, because it becomes clear from a deeper investigation of the principles of justice found in early Irish law. And some of them you'll be able to learn about in the other podcast called An Introduction to the Brehon Law. But once again, these Statutes of Kilkenny, this decree of the king, was in vain, because it had little effect anywhere else in Ireland except for the Pale. Further effort to assert dominance was made in 1494 under King Henry VII. Under King Henry's appointment, Sir Edward Poynings assembled a parliament in Drogheda, County Louth, with the intention of making Ireland submissive to the English crown once more. Making the introduction of Tudor rule in Ireland, two statutes were enacted which together are known as Poynings Law. These held that all future legislation and assemblies of Irish Parliament required the approval of the King's Privy Council, and that all existing English law applied throughout Ireland. But again, this was of little effect beyond the Pale, where the early Irish traditions and Brehon law continued to flourish. Areas outside the Pale experienced a revival of Irish culture. The Gaelic lords recovered their lands and increased their power. Central Ulster was home to the mighty O'Neill clan, while South Munster we had the O'Sullivans and the McCarthys. Those clans were strongest in South Munster. And Wexford and Wicklow were the homes to the Kavanaghs and the O'Tooles. And in County Clare you had the powerful O'Brien clan. The first long-lasting and significant attack on early Irish customs happened under the reign of the second monarch of the Tudor dynasty, King Henry VIII. Under Henry's reign, the English monarch would cease holding the title of Lordship of Ireland and instead hold the title to the Kingdom of Ireland, securing his position as ruler over the entire land. With the help of his chief minister, the second Earl of Essex, Thomas Cromwell, King Henry implemented a policy called surrender and regrant. Surrender and regrant required Irish lords to voluntarily submit their lands and hand them over to the crown, only to have them returned back to them under royal charter. They would be granted English titles of nobility, and they would be permitted to sit in the English-controlled Irish Parliament upon swearing an oath of fealty to the English king. For some time in Ireland, the position of Lord Deputy was held by the Fitzgerald's clan of Kildare. The 9th Earl of Kildare, Lord Deputy Gerald Fitzgerald, also known as Gearóid Og, which means young Gerald, was a powerful man and had conquered the lands of many rival clans. More than a soldier, he was also an academic, having founded the first College of Maynooth in Kildare around 1524. However, earlier in his career he was accused of maladministration, and he was summoned to England and removed from his position in government. He was replaced by the second Duke of Norfolk, Thomas Howard, and Thomas Howard later married the King's cousin, Lady Elizabeth Grey. When the now ousted Gerald Fitzgerald returned to Ireland, he set about rallying allied chieftains to attack the new Lord Deputy. And what followed was a number of years of battles between rival clans. Most notably were the Fitzgeralds of Kildare, of course, against the Butlers and the Earls of Ormond. And they were sort of battling over who gets to hold this position of Lord Deputy. After multiple appeals to the king for assistance from both sides, and with both sides claiming that they were the ones who had been wronged by the other in some way, and both sides claiming, some sort of compensation, it became clear by 1533 that animosity between the two families was so strong that war was inevitable, so long as either family held the title of Lord Deputy of Ireland. Gerald Fitzgerald was summoned to England once again in 1534. However, this time he did not return to Ireland. Having been convicted of several charges, he was imprisoned in the Tower of London. Believing his father had been executed, Thomas Fitzgerald, the 10th Earl of Kildare, rallied 140 horsemen, and wearing helmets helmed with a silken fringe, they rode to St. Mary's Abbey in Dublin to publicly denounce their allegiance to King Henry VIII. This act of defiance earned him the nickname Silken Thomas, and he went on to lead a rebellion against the English rule in Ireland by first attacking the stronghold of Dublin Castle. But the story of Silken Thomas is but another tragic chapter of failed rebellion in Irish history. Driven by anger and a desire to avenge his father's execution, Thomas's determination was his downfall. He ordered the Archbishop of Clontarf be executed for attempting to intervene and find a resolution, and thus not only did he lose the support of the clergy and general sympathy for his cause, he now faced the very serious threat of excommunication. The very cruel twist of fate here is that his father, young Gerald Fitzgerald, had not been executed at all, and he was still in the Tower of London. He was no doubt living in squalor and being treated as a prisoner, but it wasn't until the news had reached him of his son's failing rebellion and impending excommunication that he was overcome with grief and died. Silken Thomas was killed by Sir William Skeffington in March 1935, having suffered losses and retreating from Dublin to his stronghold in Maynooth in his homelands of County Kildare. The failed rebellion caused Henry to pay much closer attention to Irish affairs and may have directly influenced the creation of further significant pieces of legislation. King Henry VIII is well known for his chop and change approach to his marriages, and this led to the incidental creation of the Protestant Church of England. King Henry's desire for a male heir and his willingness to simply dispose of those who failed to produce reflects the patriarchal dominance that was found throughout history, and particularly at that time. And it marks a real clear distinction from the neighbouring Irish system, which revered women much more highly than most of the world at that time. Fearing excommunication and the implied damnation that went with it, Henry sought a special papal dispensation which would annul his marriage to Queen Catherine of Aragon, opening the way for his legal marriage to Anne Boleyn. When this request was refused, Henry made the bold move of ordering the Archbishop of Canterbury, the head of the Catholic Church in England, to annul his marriage to Queen Catherine, and in so doing he created a ripple effect that resonates to this day. Henry was excommunicated by Pope Clement VII, and later, in 1534, the Act of Supremacy was passed, severing the ecclesiastical authority of the Holy See, of the Vatican, and declaring the monarch to be the supreme head of the Church of England, a title which remains to this day. This was later followed up by the Treason Act of 1537, which made slandering the sovereign a hangable offence, thus putting a stop to anyone who would criticise the king's claims of legitimacy. This unsound reasoning by which these decisions were arrived, and the fact that they became law and reality and history, just serves to highlight the weak and even unjust, unfair, corrupt foundations of these systems of law. Systems where the law is determined by the dictates of a sovereign entity, and whether that's an individual king or a pope or a dictator, or if it's a group of individuals in government, it doesn't matter. But these systems where they can just dictate a rule and can simply write a decree and have it enforced, regardless of the moral qualities it may or may not possess. But King Henry's creation of the Church of England and his leaving of the Catholic Church created a very interesting situation. Remember, the initial authority over Ireland was given to King Henry through the papal bull, King Henry II, through the papal bull Laudabiliter, which bestowed upon him and his heirs the title of Dominus Hiberniae, Lord of Ireland. And through this, the king would act as the Vatican's agent in Ireland by collecting taxes and establishing the supremacy of the Roman Church and the Holy See in Ireland. The dissolution of papal authority through the Act of Supremacy also led to the dissolution of the king's claim to the title of Dominus Hiberniae, Lord of Ireland. But Henry, being the king and now being the head of the church, simply created a new title for himself when his parliament passed the Crown of Ireland Act in 1542. This was an act that would make the King of England, his heirs and successors, kings of Ireland. It's all to do with title. Now he held a title which was recognised only by the Protestant monarchs at the time, but he held a title nonetheless to the claim of the Kingdom of Ireland. At first his claim was ignored by the papacy, obviously, and the Catholic monarchs of Europe, and it wasn't until 1553 when the English polity, the English structure, was shook up by the forceful Mary Tudor, who was the daughter of Henry VIII by his first wife, Queen Catherine of Aragon. Queen Mary I was a staunch Catholic and the first woman to successfully succeed the throne of England upon the death of her brother, King Edward VI. King Edward VI was the only son of King Henry, and he was crowned a boy king at the tender age of 9. Imagine that. Imagine a 9-year-old boy born into royalty, put a crown upon his head, and he's the ruler of a nation. This could never happen under the Brehon Law. Again, because of the rules of inheritance, how they passed the title of being the chieftain of the clan. So once Queen Mary succeeded to the throne, her first act of parliament was to recognise her father's marriage to her mother, which had been annulled, and this further legitimised her claim as rightful heir. And finding England in the aftermath of King Henry's efforts at reformation, Queen Mary sought to thwart the rise of Protestantism and put an end to the religious and political turmoil plaguing her land. Her cruel persecution of Protestants during this time earned her the name Bloody Mary. With the supremacy of the Vatican restored through this Catholic monarch, The claim to monarch of Ireland was recognised by the papacy in 1555 and acknowledged Queen Mary to be sovereign over the Kingdom of Ireland. As a result, there would be two states, two lands, two peoples, but only one prevailing monarch. As time passes, the push for English dominance over the land of Ireland increases. Efforts to pacify and anglicise the native Irish people included the enactment of martial law in areas that were most hostile to the foreign command, but again, these efforts had little lasting effects. Attempts at English plantations in Offaly and Laois were unsuccessful, and later plantations in Munster came into legal difficulties when local landowners decided to sue. This point alone gives another small indicator of the awareness that these people had for law. The fact that they were going to sue these people who came over with the plantations and claimed this land as their own. In 1558, Queen Mary was succeeded by Queen Elizabeth I, who continued her attempts at pacification of Ireland through several policies, including the exemption of local lords from paying tax where they give allegiance to the monarch. So they just, give a tax break to the local lords. They're trying to buy them, to buy their allegiance. And instead of having continuous battles, people want to be free. People have a desire to be free. And these monarchs know that if you're going to try to impose the will with troops on the streets and by force, the Irish are going to fight back, and they're going to continue to fight back as long as it takes. So the idea of pacification is, to just appease the Irish, make it so that their circumstances are so comfortable that they don't have the need to rebel. But it's becoming clear at this point in history that religion is a huge dividing ground. It's the gang sign. It's the side that one would fight for or die for or against, Protestantism and Catholicism. With a Protestant monarch back on the English throne, Queen Elizabeth, the authority to the claim of the Kingdom of Ireland was once again revoked by the Vatican. In February 1570, Queen Elizabeth was renounced as a heretic, and the Vatican called her the pretended Queen of England and the servant of crime. And this was in a papal decree issued by Pope Pius V. Her claims of legitimacy over the predominantly Catholic Ireland became tenable as her authority was questioned. Nonetheless, under Elizabeth's reign, a successful plantation was created in Ulster. The powerful clans of the north, like the O'Neills of Ulster and the O'Donnells of Tyrconnell, joined sides in a war of rebellion against the English forces stationed in Ireland in a rebellion known as the 9 Years' War. Now, the leader of the O'Neills at this time was Hugh O'Neill, and he's a very interesting character in Irish history, a man who used political guile and determination and a master tactician to manipulate the English into providing him with the resources he needed to launch a rebellion back against them. And throughout these decades, the religious divides, which are today so characteristics of Irish politics, when people think of modern Ireland, particularly people from different countries think of modern Ireland, they quickly think of the Troubles or the Catholic Protestant issue. And at this time in history, we see the Irish clans seeking the help of Catholic Spain, who sent troops over to assist in the uprising. One is reminded here of the Spanish Armada, the invincible fleet that set sail from Spain to England, full of troops and ready for battle, but which sunk off the coast of Ireland when it was struck by heavy storms. You see, by then the struggle between Catholic and Protestant dominance of Ireland had become a primary driving factor in political events. So much time had passed that the struggle for Irish culture and identity, free from these foreign imports, had started to become a memory of a distant past, several hundred years. While the customs and the laws remained in some form, the struggle was beginning to shift focus towards religion in a huge way. In 1601, the Irish forces were defeated at the Battle of Kinsale, and by 1603 the authority of the English crown under the Protestant Queen Elizabeth was all but secured. Once the war had ended, O'Neill and his allies who had fought in the rebellion were returned their lands, could keep their riches and their titles of nobility given to them by the crown. However, their authority was greatly diminished, and they felt heavily restricted by some of the conditions imposed. They were required to swear loyalty to the crown, and they would have their property distributed according to the English rules of inheritance, rather than the customs found under the Brehon Law. This event marks the end of the old Gaelic order, as the last of the ancient aristocracy left its shores. These Earls decided to take flight from Ireland on September the 14th, 1607, and this event, of all things mentioned so far, is perhaps the single greatest blow to the destruction of the use of the Brehon Law in Ireland. Seizing the opportunity caused by the vacuum left by the departure, the British government confiscated 6 of the 9 counties of that province and officially began the plantation of Ulster in 1609, now under the reign of King James I. To get an idea of what this system of colonisation through plantation works like, you need look no further than the modern Israeli state, who implemented plantation policies in Palestine once they gained the recognition as a legitimate state shortly after World War II. It involves moving large numbers of people to a foreign land in an effort to spread one's own culture and beliefs over a wider area of land, while diluting the existing native beliefs. In 1599, a man was born in Huntingdon, England, who would serve as an instrument in what has been described as a conscious attempt to reduce a distinct ethnic population. In other words, a genocide against the Irish people. The brutal Oliver Cromwell was the man who famously declared to Heller to Connacht when launching a siege of death and destruction in a land grab for the crown, which resulted in the estimated deaths of 600,000 native Irish. It is said that he behaved differently in England and Scotland than how he did in Ireland, which, to be honest, how he behaved in Ireland could rightly be described as barbaric. But he did it with such a religious conviction that the papacy was evil, Catholicism must be stopped, and the supremacy of the Protestant Church established, that he felt justified in his actions. The bloodiest sieges occurred in Drogheda in County Louth and at County Wexford. His tirade, which lasted 40 weeks from August 1649 to May 1650, served only to decay native Irish society even further into an irreparable state. Cromwell is also credited as being responsible for the major destruction of Ireland's native woodlands. A land which was once covered with natural forest was ripped up and exported for English crown profit. The Irish people had a connection with forests, and they had a deep mythology surrounding trees. To witness the land being desecrated of its natural forests was to witness the destruction of one's own home, one's habitat, and one's connection to nature. And when I think of this, I just think that this is just one of the scars that have been left on the psyche of the Irish people, that is yet to be healed. The first sign of the fierce penal laws came after the failed gunpowder plot of 1605, where English Catholics attempted to blow up the Houses of Parliament, killing all Protestant heirs to the throne so that it might be reclaimed by a Catholic once again. Shortly after, in 1607, a law was passed which prohibited Catholics from holding public offices or serving in the army. Catholics were later required to pay fines for not attending Anglican church services, and they had several of these sort of laws imposed on them, but all it did was serve to sort of antagonise the Irish people, and led the unfair treatment led to another uprising, which occurred in 1641. And this uprising was the one that eventually, it was around the same time as Cromwell's conquest, and this was the one that actually put an end to Cromwell's conquest. But in the 1650s, the Catholics were barred from Parliament, and landowners had their properties seized. And following a revolution in England against the monarchy, which was around this time, and around the 1680s, there was a revolution against the monarchy in England, and this caused King James II to flee. And where did he flee? He fled to Ireland. And at this time, while the crown was in turmoil, and wasn't sitting in Parliament in England, a provisional Irish Catholic majority, Patriot Parliament, decided to use the opportunity to rescind the earlier laws seizing Catholic land and things like that. So following a lot of skirmishes and battles and squabbles between Catholic and Protestant factions and lords and things like this, in 1691 there was a document called the Treaty of Limerick signed, and this allowed Catholics to practice their beliefs so long as, wait for it, they swear an oath of fealty to the prevailing monarchs and their heirs. At that time it was William III of England and Mary II of Scotland. And by doing so, they would de facto acknowledge the supremacy of the Anglican Church and monarchy. The full severity of the penal laws came later, however. It was around 1695 onwards. In addition to a ban on holding public offices, the penal laws banned intermarriage between Catholics and Protestants. They could not vote, they could not educate their young in their own schools. And it was decreed, it was made a law so that if a Catholic died, their property would be divided equally among their heirs, unless the eldest son converted to Protestantism, in which case they would take everything. There was a ban on converting from Protestantism to Catholicism, which was considered to be and called popery. See, because to the Protestants, Catholicism was evil. It signifies Vatican Rome. They called it popery. And so under the penal laws, Irish man was not allowed to own a horse that was more valuable than £5. And the reason for this is they weren't allowed to own a horse that could be, could have military capabilities. That sounds strange today, but a military horse, a military grade horse, would cost more than £5. So if a Protestant wanted to purchase a horse from a Catholic and they offered him £5, the Catholic was obliged to sell that horse. All Catholics were barred from involvement in the judiciary and legal offices. Just imagine being born into a time where your country and its people have been oppressed for centuries. And at this stage, when you were born, it is just the norm. Your culture and heritage is just a distant memory. And you're born into this system of inherent injustice, completely disconnected from, the true sense of self, true sense of culture that existed on that land, and feeling completely disempowered to do anything about it. To be honest with you, that actually sounds pretty familiar. But it was these austere policies under the penal laws which caused the eventual dying out of native Irish culture. After the flight of the Earls, society began to crumble. It was based on a clan structure and it dated back for centuries, if not millennia of tradition. And the Irish aristocracy, who were called Rí, or kings, or lords, or earls, provided the support mechanism for the Brehons. They protected the Brehons and felt duty-bound to do so in order to preserve the law as established and practiced by their ancestors. When they left, they took that protection and the old ways began to die out. Being prohibited from teaching the youth and fearing death as a consequence, the old ways which were preserved orally in the minds of the great Brehons, the sages, the bards and the poets of Ireland, the wisdom of its rich heritage was destroyed to being all but a distant memory. Just a romantic idea of some time long ago, a mystical golden age. And the tragedy is that in the wars for Catholic and Protestant dominance over the land known of Ireland, the struggle for Irish existence was lost. The Brehon laws were an oral tradition, but much was written down about them as well, as I said, from around the 7th century onwards. And we do have a lot of information there from parchments and different law tracts which have come down to us. And we've much more than comparable societies like, say, African tribes or American tribes. But it has to be said, it's a sad fact that far more has been lost than what has been saved. And there are huge gaps of information, as there's stuff that we will never know, but at the same time there's scores of untranslated parchments just sitting in dusty vaults of Trinity College Library, or who knows what could be hidden away in the private libraries of the descendants of the early Protestant ascendancy in Ireland. And they should probably remain in those vaults and in those libraries for many, many years more, because interest in this deep aspect of our culture is strangely lacking from Irish minds. So try next time you're out in town or in a taxi, or try and spread the knowledge a bit. Just ask someone, have you ever heard of the Brehon Law? And take it from there. I have yet to come across someone just in general public who has known about it, other than the fact that it existed and it was old Irish law. They wouldn't know much more than that. So while remnants of this old system of justice existed in Ireland up until around the 1700s, the course of Irish history, as I've just loosely outlined above, caused a massive schism in the Irish people's affinity with law. Their natural love and desire for justice was replaced by this deep-seated distrust, as their revered native Irish institutions were eradicated. I'd like to just finish up this little history lesson with a quote from R.W. Bentham, who was a barrister who wrote an article about the history of the English bench and bar in Ireland in 1959. And he said that the Irish irreverence for law does not stem from sympathy with crime or wrongdoing in general, but rather from the fact that the Irish, who have a longish memory, are aware even now that the law in Ireland is not Irish law. However just it may be, and it was once most unjust, it does not command reverence as a native institution, but simply respect nowadays as an essential part of the machinery of government. I'd like to thank you for tuning in to this lesson in the Brehon Law. I hope that you've taken something from it. I hope it encourages you to do your own research and look into it, and come on to Tirnasir, put up discussions, and keep talking about it. This is how these ideas get out. We talk about them to each other, we flesh them out, we look for inconsistencies. Let's apply the trivium method to the Brehon Law, because I firmly believe, and I have looked into them a lot. I could give you several examples of things in modern society that could be corrected through an application of the principles, not the exact same system, but the principles of law found under the Brehon Laws. And at a time where we are in such uncertainty, economically, socially, politically, and yes, even culturally, with this advent of European Union, Europeanism, or whatever it is, we should, I believe, we the people should really invest time into exploring these lost laws of ancient Ireland.